Well, South Africa is hoping to secure a bilateral trade deal in the agriculture sector with the U.S. during this week's meeting between President Cyril Ramaphosa and U.S. President Donald Trump. Agriculture Minister John Steenhuisen is part of the delegation and will play a key role in negotiations aimed at ensuring the continuation of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA. The meeting is also seen as an opportunity to reset the strained relations between these two nations and to secure a more favorable trade framework. For more on the story, we're joined now by Dr Mmatlou Kalaba. He's a senior analyst and executive director at the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy. Dr Kalaba, thanks very much indeed for joining us here on 405. High stakes talks, particularly for the agricultural sector. What else are we hoping for?
Thank you, Michelle, and good afternoon to you and the viewers. Well, as you put it, this is almost a dual mission visit to the U.S., as it includes both the diplomatic as well as the trade elements of the relations between South Africa and the United States. Like you mentioned, trade relations have already been strained with the AGOA being put on hold, if one may. On the other side, then diplomatically as well as other foreign relations between the two countries have been on a bedrock for a number of months now. So this meeting actually, as a start, is a very good stepping stone because it allows an opportunity for engagements around those difficult situations, both trade as well as foreign relations. So what we can expect, I think, first and foremost, our president would try to explain some of the elements which have been mentioned in the media as the reasons why the relations, particularly on trade, as well as the domestic policies. But I think the best option or the best outcome on trade side would be if AGOA can be sustained at the level where it is, that is for South Africa, and still be able to access that market. And then the next step would be to try and get that extended, even though AGOA is not a South Africa-US bilateral, but is the US Sub-Saharan Africa agreement. But at this stage, it looks like every country would have to look after itself, and hence the delegation is expected to have discussions of that nature.
Dr. Kalaba, tariffs, as we know, are currently on pause. But we know from our own citrus growers that the US is an incredibly important market for them. Obviously, much of the sector is going to be impacted, but I think particularly for citrus growers, without the US markets, they are at risk of total collapse.
Well, the citrus, of course, as our number one export commodity, is high up on the list. But we also have other commodities that we export to the US that internally adds more value to our GDP. If you take commodities like wine, which include internal processing. You have dried raisins, you have macadamia nuts, which in the past 10 to 15 years, South Africa has invested heavily in those commodities. So indeed, those, if the US does not change its stance, they are bound to be affected heavily. And the alternative markets are there, but you do not switch overnight or even within 2 or 3 years, because the investments as well as the network and coordinations towards the markets were designed to suit the US market, obviously, because AGOA and other trade agreements provided that kind of certainty. But yes, citrus will be heavily affected, macadamia and other highly processed products, which in addition to adding forex into our economy, they do provide further employment. They allow other services to add value, as a transportation, refrigeration, insurance, finance. The entire value chain is actually at stake. It's not only the final commodity that ends up entering into the US or any other markets, but there's a backward and forward linkages, which goes back to the farm, which goes back to the rural livelihoods that are sustained by these exports.
Right. Yeah, it's incredibly worrying, isn't it? Just from what you've said, the fact that it's the entire value chain that will be impacted. I doubt whether anyone would say no to South African wines, though.
Well, I don't think the answer is no to the wines. It's just that it will cost them more because of the tariffs, obviously, as the center of these discussions. And hence, our hope is that indeed tomorrow, I suppose that's when actually we will have a sense of how the discussions went. But I am confident that currently, as we speak, there are discussions behind closed doors. South African president, went there with 4 other ministers. There are other business people who are either facilitators or, let's say, representing certain aspects of these negotiations. And I'm confident that those people, as well as those discussions, would provide a landing spot for when the 2 leaders actually get into the details. A lot has been agreed behind closed doors, or some compromises have been reached.
So if you were the agriculture minister who's part of this delegation going into these talks, Dr. Kalaba, what would you be able to put on the table in terms of leverage for this partnership with the US to continue?
Yes, I'll be in a difficult position if I was the agriculture minister. And I think part of the reason what would put me in that difficult position would be the fact that it has always been maintained, or let me say, suspected that trade is a side issue, but there are other elements, if I'm allowed to digress a bit, to talk about things relating to Israel, things relating to other businesses and influences within what the US intends to access in South Africa to influence the foreign policy, but also to align with the US, say, policy stance on a number of geopolitical matters. Mm-hmm. So hence the agriculture minister is in a difficult position. But if we bring it closer to home, in other words, to discuss agriculture-related matters. So the U.S. agriculture has certain interest into South African market, which currently is difficult to access. For example, our poultry market, we are known to be, an importer of bone-in products. The U.S. is one of the largest exporters, but over the years, we've been able to apply anti-dumping duties on the U.S. market to protect our domestic producers. So that is, if the agricultural discussion are focused on agricultural matters, those will be the first point where the U.S. will look into. The pork as well as beef, U.S. has always maintained high interest into our market, which is actually growing, even though our economy has not grown that fast. But the demand for those products on agriculture have been increasing, but the US has not been able to penetrate this market. So those would be the first points to be discussed on agriculture-related matters. But I suspect that agriculture, it will be let me not say small, but there are bigger issues than agriculture in this entire state visit.
No, absolutely. It's not an isolated issue. There are, as you say, so many other geopolitical issues feeding into the US's stance on South Africa at the moment. So should we be thinking, Dr. Kalaba, about our position with other trade groups, BRICS, the G20, access to other markets? Should we start looking to other options for South Africa?
Well, I think that has always been part of the strategy, even going back to our readmission into the international trading bloc back in the mid-90s, and when we get into the 2000s, when we started having a much broader strategy towards international market access. However, some of these options were never put into action. So, but the strategy of diversification, accessing as wider markets as possible, has always been there. The challenge, as you gave an example of BRICS, is that when you consider these markets, you also must take into account what you offer them. What are you going to take from them at the same level that you want to access those markets? And BRICS countries, for example, China and India, just as the two examples. They are all developing countries to the same level as South Africa. They are also producing and exporting labor-intensive commodities, which again is something that South Africa is looking into so that we can address some of the unemployment challenges that we have. And therefore, the give and take that you expect in BRICS gives us a very difficult, let's say, trade-offs. But at this point, and given the challenges that we have very little option but to consider those. But there's also a quite large market in the Eastern Bloc. If you take Southeast Asia countries such as Malaysia, Thailand, those are growing at a faster rate, both in terms of the population, but as well as their middle class growing. And that's what you look into when you want to sell your commodities to those markets. But yes, we need to act on the diversification aspects of our trade and economic growth. So we have always been looking into it. We just have not put it into action.